Let me explain what this technique is, which I believe can revolutionize our line work, while I also demonstrate with this drawing. But I'm not speaking to the drawing particularly with what I'm saying now. This technique is all about the rhythm of our drawing, of our line work, the tempo that we create when we draw. Now, this is a very individual thing, so we do need to develop it ourselves, our own way. But there are some strategies which I think can help us to develop this tempo, this rhythm, more effectively and faster. Now, this might be something that could particularly benefit you with your line work if any of the following are problems for you, that you end up with unfinished drawings all the time, or different parts of the drawing look like different people have drawn them, that there are awkward lines or artificial looking lines or heavy, stiff lines, if there's an issue with outlining too much, hesitant lines, or if some parts of the drawing end up having a cartoon-like look compared to the rest of the drawing. Because a lot of these problems are line work tempo issues, I believe. That when we draw, we speed up, we slow down, we get scared and hesitate, we rush some parts because we think they're easier or whatever, we pause. So these strategies are for developing and strengthening against doing these things, improving the pace of our drawing, not to make it fast or slow, but to get it into a rhythm, into a pattern that we can then be consistent with in all of our drawings. And the very first strategy is to have some sort of warm-up. Now, if you've watched many of my videos, you've probably heard me say that what I like to do before I start drawing is to make some preparatory marks on paper. Now, I'm not planning the drawing, I'm not composing things, and it's not a thumbnail. It's playing around with a few parts of the composition that I think might be a bit challenging with my line work, or where I'm not quite sure how to create the effect I want to create, or often I'm not sure what thickness of pen to use, so I can try different parts out with different pens and see which ones actually work best for the amount of detail and for where it sits in the depth of the composition. And what this means is, and this is about 3 minutes max, but what this means is that when I start drawing, I hit the ground running. My eye-hand coordination has started. That creative thinking process in my brain where I'm trying to interpret my subject into line work has already started and it's ticking along. And so all those possibly wobbly or hesitant initial first lines where we're still exploring our way, they've all happened on my scrap of paper and not on the drawing. So the drawing's looking better from the start, which builds confidence, and I'm actually in a further developed place when I start my drawing. Now, just the very words and concepts of rhythm and tempo, they relate to time. They relate to pace in something. And the time that something happens in is very significant for this. So planning at least approximately the time we're going to draw our drawing in, I think is really important, really helpful. My lines are going to be different if I know I've got 10 minutes to draw something or 2 hours to draw something. And it's not just that I'll draw more details if I have more time, but it's how I draw my lines. If I start thinking I have a 2-hour drawing and then halfway through I decide to finish it in 15 minutes, the line work's going to look very different for the second half that was done in 15 minutes rather than the half that was done in an hour. The time we spend matters, and it's obvious put that way. And look, we can't plan the rhythm of our drawing if we have no expectation of time. If we're just thinking, oh, I'll finish it when I finish it. We're better off finishing a drawing than having one half finished. And another helpful thought to have about that is that there are things about finishing a drawing that we can't learn until we're finishing the drawing. If I very seldom finish my drawings, then I don't get to learn and develop these finishing a drawing skills. But with a time limit, even approximately, then I have a constant tempo to push myself with my line work, to help me determine how I draw the lines, how briskly, how quickly, how much care takes into the, not so much care, but how much time I've got to coordinate the lines and how they sit with each other. And if I maintain this thinking consistently throughout the drawing, then it will create a certain sameness in the lines. I don't mean sameness in a boring way, but in a good unifying way, that like the whole drawing was done by the one person in a confident and consistent way. It doesn't mean that we draw half the building in an hour of a 2-hour session and the second half in the second half hour. My tempo is probably that I do a quarter of the drawing in the first half of the time, because it takes me more time to position things carefully. The key central areas are usually the ones I draw first, and they also often have more detail that I have to position and work out as well. And I find that my confidence in line work also increases with the drawing progressing, and then I become faster. And I'm often, for the more peripheral parts that I draw in the second section, I'm drawing the effect rather than the exactness of the details, and that usually is a faster thing than drawing the distance. And particularly if I'm drawing the furthest parts of my scene in the second part phase of my drawing, then there's often a lot less detail that I'm drawing with them. So I find that, my tempo is that I do 3/4 of the drawing in the second half. And that's why it's important that we get to that stage, because we don't learn that about our own rhythm until we are consistently finishing our drawings. I spent 18 months doing 6-hour drawings for Instagram using a 4x4 grid, and that was quite an intense tempo. And then I did 2-hour freehand ink drawings for YouTube, and it's now changed to 30 to 60 minute drawings, and I've made them smaller. And what I've discovered is there's a different tempo when the size changes. So that's my next point. If we want to revolutionize our line work, it helps to draw consistently the same size and not too large. I mean, it doesn't really matter what size we use. I usually draw for my YouTube videos on A5 size on an A4 sheet of paper, rather than the A4 size on an A3 sheet of paper I was doing in my 6-hour drawings. And I find, though, that drawing a bit smaller, I can be more gestural, freer with my lines, because generally drawing smaller lines, shorter lines, are easier to control line work with. So generally, if I'm trying to improve my line work, it can be helpful not to go too large. But of course, I'm not saying go tiny. But it's certainly easier to draw a straight line freehand if the line's 10 centimetres long rather than 30 or 40 centimetres long. The next tip or strategy for improving our line work is to finish the drawing in one session, because we've been talking about rhythm and pace, and it builds up and develops. Imagine going to a concert with a piece of classical music as it builds throughout the performance to its conclusion. Well, we wouldn't leave the concert halfway through and then maybe come back the next week halfway through to pick up the rest and really expect we're going to be in the same place and be able to get back into the tempo and the rhythm, because we won't be able to pick up really the place that we left. And it's the same with our drawing. In an hour drawing, the final 20 minutes of line work and marks is a result partly of the first 40 minutes. And the cohesion, the unity of the whole drawing is that those marks develop from the pace and the tempo and the thinking of the first 40 minutes. And we can't get that back a week later. We're starting cold, and it's almost like we're starting a new drawing on half the page of an earlier drawing. I mean, sometimes we are interrupted, and some people do have a meticulous drawing style, and every drawing takes 24 hours to draw, and that's a different category again. But generally, I think we should adapt our drawing plans to the time that we can finish in one session. And for some of us, we might be able to sit down for 2 or 3 hours and do a drawing without stopping. But for others, it might mean we do lots of 15, 20, 30-minute drawings, and that's fine. So how's this drawing going? This drawing took me it took me about 40 minutes to do in real time. 40, probably 45 minutes actually. And in my thinking, this was going to take me somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes, but I was thinking probably closer towards 60 minutes, simply because it's a bit of a fussy scene with the architecture and the angles and the shading and trying to work out how these different parts align with each other. There's a little more time spent on aligning with this. But generally, I was happy with how this turned out, and certainly my line work became much brisker as we went on. This last section was done really quite quickly compared to the first section. I think in some ways it's a bit overpowered by line work, because between the hatching for the shade and the shadows, and then hatching to represent the brickwork, and then some of the other textures, the tiles and the leaves, it's probably just a bit too full of lines. So I have to work out whether there's something else I can do with this to perhaps introduce a bit more visual clarity. And this is where colour can make a big difference. I think that it does help differentiate areas that otherwise tonally can be looking a bit the same. Or perhaps I just need to darken some parts of the hatching more than others. But certainly I find that by having most of my drawings not much more than 60 minutes, sometimes they go to 75 minutes, I find I've really been able to, I think, improve my line work, the gestural briskness, and it's made me appreciate the importance of this in creating line work that has life, that has a sense of vitality to it, that almost feels like it's moving slightly when we look at it. Because what we don't want are really stiff, wooden, static lines, and they tend to happen when we draw the lines overly slowly and with a little too much intensity, and sometimes that even means we're leaning too heavily on our pen and the lines can end up being a bit thick, and that also happens if we draw them slowly. So having a pace, having a tempo, having a rhythm that we develop ourselves over a number of drawings from the first line to the last line is a really important thing if we want to develop our line work so that it has a nice lively look, that it doesn't look cartoony or heavy, but particularly if we also want to develop all the skills we need when we draw. If we only ever finish one drawing in 3 or 4, then those final drawing things that we do in a drawing are perhaps always going to be a week apart because we haven't matched our experience with those as we have with the other parts of the drawing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. I'll post this photo on my community channel if you want to have a go drawing this. But whatever you draw, why not set yourself a time and without being manic about it, try and stick to it. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.